Good evening and welcome to another Theological Foundations for Race Conversations live stream. Andy Farmer, happy to serve here with Jared Torrence to kind of help us as a church work in these areas. Before I get started in my message, we have an exciting thing that's going on. Beginning today, actually, we have launched a web page on the Covenant Fellowship website. Under the resources section, you would see an ethnic harmony tab. And what we try to do is put all of our resources that we feel can be helpful on race and ethnicity conversations in one spot, so that you, or if somebody else has an interest in what we're thinking about and talking about, they can find everything in one place. You'll find in there key messages we've done over the last few years on race and justice. You'll find resources that Jared Mellinger particularly has felt like have been the best he's come across. That'll change over time. We'll continue to update that one. You'll find these live streams if you want to access previous live streams, and you'll also find access to our podcast. That Don't Fit, the podcast JT and I do. You can jump on it there as well. So it's kind of a one-stop shopping for what we're doing as a church. We felt that would be helpful so that if things are happening and we're walking through things as a church, there's a reference point to kind of know where we've been and where we're coming from. So please check that out. And it's, again, resources on the website, and then you'll see our tab there for the Ethnic Harmony webpage. So with that in mind, we're going to be talking about, again, we're talking about themes in conversations on race and ethnic harmony. And we're going to talk about humility. There was a time when many Christians could go through life never having to deal with difficult conversations about race. Some could simply avoid it because their lives didn't really confront them with the need to have a conversation about it. But those times, I believe we all know, have clearly changed. My guess is that you're here on this live stream because you are either having or want to have conversations about race. It may be with someone from a different ethnic background, or maybe someone from a different generation of your own ethnic background, maybe somebody in your family, maybe somebody at work, maybe somebody here in the church. Like it or not, circumstances in our world have forced the issue into conversation, and a lot of people have something to say. So, race conversations are really hard. You've probably noticed that. Into this pot we call race conversations go all kind of personal experiences, opinions, factoids, influences, ruminations, prejudices. We stir all that together and cook it up in our own stout concoction of ideas that others need to imbibe. We sort of feel like we've created something that people need to take in. But when we serve up our personal recipe for race in conversations or text strings or social media interactions, we shouldn't be shocked when people spit it back out at us. Something that makes eminent sense to us is not tasteful to them. So I've always wrestled with how to approach conversations on race. I've settled on a very simple principle that helps me engage in constructive dialogue, and it's simply this: humble yourself. Practice humility. So what is humility? Before we talk about what it is, let me address how the idea is being deployed in culturally derived race theories these days. Reading on race, you'll hear the term racial humility, which sounds like a great idea. But the idea of racial humility is that dominant culture people, usually understood as white, have nothing to offer a race conversation because they have not ever meaningfully dealt with the issue. You could just as easily talk about gender humility or social humility or economic humility or class humility. The idea of humility there is that dominance, however that's understood, produces blindness, ignorance, and disqualification in conversations. The job of dominant culture people in race conversations, according to this idea of racial humility, is to shut up and listen to minorities. That is their role in conversation. To put it simply, racial humility is assigning the role of ignorant student to white people in race conversations. But is this humility? Now let me say this. This idea comes from real life experience. Ethnic minorities, particularly black and brown people, are constantly confronted with how little white people tend to know and understand about being non-white. We need to acknowledge that. But this idea also rests on a fundamental flaw, that humility can be demanded of one person or one group from another person or another group. This kind of racial humility should be more accurately called racial submission or racial capitulation. There's really no humility in this concept of racial humility at all. So let's not go there for our understanding of humility. We have actually something much greater to employ, and what we have will achieve far better ends, and that's biblically understood humility. Biblical humility is a trait that in people that is highly valued by God. In Isaiah we read, "But this is the one to whom I will look, he who is humble and contrite in spirit, and trembles at my word." And in the well-known words of Micah 6:8, "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Jesus himself said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly." In other words, I am humble in heart. A key text for me in this is 1 Peter 5 and 6. Peter writes, "Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you." We're going to focus on this text this evening. The context for this letter is that it's written to Christians who were dealing with things that may seem familiar to you and me today. One commentator has described the experiences of the people that Peter is writing to like this. Rather than systemic attacks orchestrated by the state, in other words, rather than being under persecution, that would come later, the experiences of the people Peter's writing to, were neighbor on Christian barrages of verbal abuse designed to shame believers as social deviants. By publicly shaming them, they were trying to pressure the believers to conform to the values and behaviors of the larger society. Not much different than the idea of racial humility we talked about. Peter is writing to gird up believers who were being humiliated in their own neighborhoods just because they believed in Jesus. Through the letter, he calls them to trust in Jesus. He calls them to pursue holiness, to live as God's people, to be willing to be suffering for righteousness' sake, to be good stewards. But here at the end, he turns to how they should relate to others, to each other and to others. And his call is for them to humble themselves, to pursue humility. So what is humility? Now, grammatically, The biblical words that tend to develop this idea of humility, and there are a number of them, are associated with the ideas of affliction and self-denial. The idea behind all this seems to be humility is not something we will ever come to naturally. You won't meet a naturally humble person. If you see a humble person, it's either because circumstances, affliction has made them humble, or they have made it a goal of life to deny themselves for the sake of humility. If you see a person who's humble, there's a story behind how they got there. Humility isn't a gift. It isn't a personal trait. It can't be demanded from somebody like a debt. Humility comes from the overflow of a well-tended soul fixed on the lordship of Jesus. I find C.J. Mahaney's definition of humility about as clear as you can get. C.J. says, humility is honestly assessing ourselves in light of God's holiness and our sinfulness. Now, C.S. Lewis, who wasn't on target on everything, hits the mark pretty well on humility. Lewis writes, "Do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy person who's always telling you that, of course, he's a nobody. Probably all you'll think about him is that he seemed a perfectly cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all." What a novel thought. If anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. And a biggish step, too. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think you are not conceited, it means you are very conceited indeed. True humility takes the enforced racial humility of current critical theories and makes it unnecessary, even bizarre. You see, a humble person assumes he or she is ignorant, doesn't fully understand. A humble person assumes that they need to seek and learn from others. A humble person assumes a posture of listening. They don't have to be told. They don't need to be put in their place because they seek that place on their own. That's just what humble people do. And if they fail, which they do, they repent. And they seek humility afresh. There are some essential themes on the biblical virtue of humility found in bite-sized form in this passage. And we're going to spend the rest of our time looking at three key themes and how they can help us in race conversations. The first one is this. We want to look at the appropriateness of humility. Peter says that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. See, we have a gigantic cosmic piles of reasons to be humble. I was watching the other night the movie Rudy for like the 1000th time. And Rudy tells a story. It's a true story in general, then it's fictionalized for the movie, of a kid back in the early 70s who had a desire from sort of the coal belt in Ohio, had the desire to play football for Notre Dame. But he was small, clearly not an athlete that could play at Notre Dame. But it was his passion, it was his desire, his obsession. And so he couldn't even get into the school because he couldn't make the grades to get into Notre Dame. So he went to this junior college that was connected to the school, hoping that his grades would be high enough to get him into Notre Dame because he couldn't try for the football team unless he got into Notre Dame to begin with. And so semester after semester, he would work hard to go to school, and then he would never quite make the grade. He never quite had enough. And so he's getting down to his last semester before it really wouldn't work for him anyway. And so he's praying, and he goes into the chapel there at the school, and he's praying at the chapel and just asking God to get him into Notre Dame so he could play football. So finally, kindly Father Kavanaugh, who's been his sort of coach, mentor over the time, comes over to him, and Rudy asks him if there's anything else he can do to get God to answer his prayers to play for Notre Dame. The wise old priest gives him an honest and humble response. Son, Father Kavanaugh says, in 35 years of religious study, I've come up with only two hard, incontrovertible facts. There is a God, and I'm not him. Father Kavanaugh has it exactly right. Humility begins with acknowledging that there is one God, and we aren't him. The only person in the cosmos who has no reason to be humble is God, the exalted one. We, therefore, start from a posture of not God, which is the eternal state of humility. God does not oppose the proud because they irritate him. He opposes the proud because pride is treasonous stupidity in our souls. The only answer for the stupidity of pride is humility. Pride is the single biggest problem in race conversations, and we all bring it to the table. We hone our arguments. I don't know if this describes you, but it certainly describes me. We hone our arguments in these internal debates that we have with ourselves, debates actually that you and I know we always win. We have seeds of individual experiences that we cultivate into orchards of generalizations about people who are different than us. We grow our crop of pride by finding books and blogs and podcasts and anything to fertilize our prejudice, anything that makes what we say seem to have validity. Then we try to sell our crop of pride in the marketplace of race conversations. We shouldn't be shocked when no one buys our fruit. This text helps us see, if we enter a conversation like that, more than just the other person's disagreement will be against us. You don't want to double down in a race debate by inviting God to oppose you in the process as well. Better to be confident in how much we don't know and understand. Better to humble ourselves, then at least we'll be aligned with God's grace and not with his opposition. In fact, the interesting thing in this text, he says, be kind, be humble toward one another. In other words, there's no such thing as a humble hermit. Humility implies it only works if it's directed toward other people. First of all, God, we humble ourselves before the Lord, and he will raise us up. But then he says here, humble yourself toward one another. Humility must work itself out relationally. Withdrawing from people to protect our humility is not being humble at all. We must engage with people to exercise humility. George Yancey's written this: Christians know that we're not perfectible this side of heaven. We can and should become more sanctified in our actions, which means that we should try to eradicate racism and racial alienation. But we should not expect others to be perfect. We should be humble enough to recognize that we ourselves are not perfect. As imperfect sinners, all we can do is seek to help each other and help ourselves overcome the poison of sin in the form of racism. We have no basis for pride in the way we deal with racism and no basis for judging others. We should do our best to hold others accountable for their sins, but never with a haughty attitude. The second thing we want to look at is the approach of humility. Peter says to clothe yourselves with humility, humble yourself by clothing yourself with humility. The language Peter's using draws directly from his own experience. If you remember back in John, as the disciples were taking the Last Supper with Jesus in the upper room, Peter witnessed Jesus, the Savior of the universe, the divine Holy One. He watched Jesus humble himself and wrap himself in the towel of a servant to wash Peter's own dirty feet. Peter arrogantly refused to have Jesus wash his feet. Jesus rebuked him, telling Peter that if he didn't wash his feet, Peter would have no part of him. That's what Peter remembers here. That's what Peter goes back to. He remembers Jesus the Master humbling himself, clothing himself, and he uses those very same words. Wrap that towel around yourself, Peter says, as humility. The clear point is that humility won't fall down from us, from heaven, and suddenly baptize us into some kind of a warm, agreeable state in spite of our personality. We have to put it on for it to work. We're not left uninstructed by the Scriptures in this effort, though. Do you want to put on humility in a race conversation? You can actively count others more significant than yourselves. Philippians 2:3. You can cultivate a humble mind, 1 Peter 3:8, by not being wise in your own eyes, Romans 12:16. You can bear with others in love, Ephesians 4:2. You can actively and consciously put on humility going into race conversations like you actively and consciously put on a mask to go into a store during a pandemic. You have this, my experience, I'll get out of my car, I'll get all the way to the store doors, and I realize I don't have my mask. I have a choice there. I can just say, you know what, I don't want to do that. I'm going to go in and I'm just going to get in there. And what are they going to really do to me? What can they really do? Or do I humble myself and recognize it serves the interest of others and God is watching my attitude? And so do I then go back to my car, get my mask, put it on, and be humble about it? It's the same thing. We get to the very moment of a conversation and our attitude, we can tell, isn't what it really should be, and we're defensive. We have a moment there to say, okay, I need to humble myself. How do I humble myself? How do I put on humility so God can be honored in this conversation? Do you know where I find putting on humility in race conversations particularly challenging? It's actually when I talk with people who are like me in race or ethnicity. The more someone is like me in background or life experience, the more my blind spots and prejudices seem to get coddled. That's one of the things that those who are talking about this idea of racial harmony are aware of. The more people talk among themselves like, the more things get reinforced that are unhelpful. So we get that. Nothing stimulates my pride faculties more than people agreeing with me. The other side of that issue, good conversation doesn't always meet agreement. But here's the thing, the goal of pride is to deliver something that nobody needs, the glory of me. If I'm proud, I'm delivering to you my own glory. And even why would you even want it? Who would care about my glory? But that's what pride does. Pride says, this is what you need, my glory. Humility says, let me deliver something that you need, the glory of God. We all need the glory of God. God will oppose our pride in race conversations because He's not interested in making us great or right or understood or validated in other people's eyes. But He'll help us when we approach race conversations with a humble posture, because we are modeling Jesus. Philippians 2, that whole section that Jim preached about back during the holidays on Jesus and His humility. That's so we can model Him. And that's what is always the most important thing. The great black preacher of our generation, John Perkins, has said, if Jesus is truly our master, then humility and brokenness will become doable. And brothers and sisters, it is doable. We can do it. It doesn't require a heavy theological study. It doesn't require years and years of being a Christian. It doesn't require a lot of gifting. It simply requires us being willing to clothe ourselves in humility. So doing humility then leads us to a third insight, the application of humility. Peter exhorts Christians to humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you. Jerry Bridges once wrote, humility is a fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of His ministry in our hearts. But this ministry does not come without deliberate, conscious effort on our part. The Spirit does not make us humble. He enables us to humble ourselves. Humility it's work. It's hard work, and it never seems to feel natural. I don't know if you've noticed this. I've never felt natural trying to be humble. It always feels like I'm trying to do something that doesn't fit who I am. It's never comfortable. But we humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God. Now, we tend to read that like this. You see, we don't really want to humble ourselves, but God has to use His big old hand to press us down to make us humble. And so humility is God pressing us down to make us humble. But that's not what's going on here. Remember, humility can never be forced on someone. Humility can't be forced on us by God. It has to be embraced. We can do humility with others because Jesus did humility with us. He allowed His Father to press Him down with His almighty hand, even to death on the cross, so that by this same almighty hand, God might raise us up to new life. To be under the mighty hand of God means we humble ourselves with the confidence that God is for us and that He's lifting us up as we lower ourselves. Lemuel Haynes, the great black preacher of our founding generation, preached, the humble Christian will feel his own weakness and insufficiency to do anything of himself and will see that all his sufficiency is of God, and his faith and hope will rest on His power and providence to do all, which will be a motive to diligence. We need diligence. We can't pursue ethnic harmony as a people if we kind of gin ourselves up for that one conversation to prove we had one, and then survive it, and then try to hope never to have another one of those again. Anything worth doing requires diligence. We want to grow and change, not just as individuals, but as a church. If we're all diligently pursuing humility, then the promises from God of more grace and greater wisdom and a greater display of God's glory, because that's the idea behind us being raised up and exalted, those will create a safe place for race conversations and real change in the midst of a proud and divided world. Race humility as a cultural demand will not advance the cause of ethnic harmony. But true humility of the biblical kind can and will. If we, the church, do the work humility requires. Once more from George Yancey. He says, the lack of safe places to discuss racial issues in the secular world means that Christians should work harder to create safe places in our churches. People will be able to explore genuine answers instead of parroting secular models. Honest dialogue in a Christian setting is vital, since our faith teaches us the role of human depravity in the development of racism. We will understand not only what people of other races may be insensitive, that people of other races may be insensitive to our perspective as on racial issues, but that we may be insensitive to their perspective as well. When we humbly realize the implications of human depravity, we can work toward creating the safe places necessary for racial healing. So what can you do? Friends, brothers, sisters, to create those safe places for racial healing. Culturally constructed racial humility has this 4-word command that must be followed in any race conversation. Minority people should be saying it. Majority people should be obeying it. And that statement is this, 4 words. Shut up and listen. There's no humility if that's what's required for racial humility. Let me instead offer you some better 4-word sentences that we can all use. If any of these are appearing in the conversations you're trying to have, then you're probably doing the work of putting on humility. And I want to commend you for it. More importantly, God will take notice. So if you're in a conversation, you should hope that these kind of sentences, 4 words, can come out of your mouth. I didn't know that. That's just my perspective. Would you consider this? That's a great point. You've really helped me. Thanks for being patient. Have you felt respected? Can we pray together? These are the words, and this is the work of true humility in racial conversations. Amen.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy, for taking the time to serve us specifically in that way. It's not easy to preach on humility because there's always that kind of weird, like, if I'm preaching about this, I must display this perfectly. But again, that's the still thinking about yourself as you're doing that. But no, thank you for encouraging us, challenging us in certain ways on the virtue of humility. We do want to give you a second to kind of collect yourself before jumping into the panel discussion. So, Leo, anything from that sermon that was particularly striking, or because there are several points when I was listening, I'm just like, oh, okay, let me just note that, let me log that away. Any kind of response from you as we're getting started here?
Yeah, I mean, so many points. You're like, oh, I need to do that better. You think back to your own conversations even the last couple of weeks. But particularly, I think when he was dropping into Philippians 2 and the idea of considering others more significant than yourselves, I really think that does kind of put flesh on the skeleton of humility, because the humility can be this enigma in a certain way. Like, I know I'm supposed to be humble, so I just have to be sad all the time. Like, there can be all these false things about humility that we assume. And that idea of prizing others' interests is one, in these types of conversations, when you're speaking to someone that's different than you, that's coming from a different world than you, that aspect of considering others more significant is vital in breeding the unity and the affection of a relationship. And I know there's been multiple times where I've had conversations with folks who disagree with me, where I walk away feeling loved and appreciated because they've taken the time to value what I've said. So definitely that one was something that was striking me. And the other thing is just that humility requires work. It's not just something that sort of parachutes down on us when we decide to follow Christ. It's a laborious thing, and I think that's a helpful thing for racial conversations, especially considering that, in all of our other conversations, we understand that humility is really difficult. You think about your small group where people go back and forth sharing maybe current struggles with sin. Everybody's like, yeah, I'm really struggling with pride right now. And that's a very common thing. But then when we get into these conversations about racial things or even maybe political things, pride can kind of go out the window. I'm not being proud. It can be like a separate category. So I think recognizing that in these conversations, like all other conversations, I'm going to have to put on humility and clothe myself actively, even mentally, as I prep for those conversations. I think that's just so helpful. So it's really helpful.
That's excellent. Yeah, and so humility can feel like this kind of nebulous idea, but we all can, to some degree, recognize humility when we see it. Although sin is incredibly deceptive, and because we can all recognize pride when it comes up too. All of us here have been involved in several conversations surrounding race and ethnicity, and I appreciate the conversations you've had where you walked away feeling loved, but not every conversation goes that way. Like there's a lot of conversations where you can start to feel it go south. You can start feeling your emotions engage in an unhelpful way. You can feel humility slowly dying away. You start to feel offended, and pride starts creeping up. What do you guys do when that starts to happen? When you start saying, "I was like, I can feel myself engaging in this in a different way." Like what do you do in those moments, in those conversations?
Well, usually there's something about what they've said that's kind of leading me to that place. So one of my go-tos, and now I'm kind of putting this out there, so if I do this to you, you know why I'm doing it.
That's right.
So don't hold it against me. But one of the things I'll do is I'll say, when you said that, that made me actually assume this, or I felt this way when you said that. What were you aiming for in that? And a lot of times when you give someone the opportunity to walk something back, they do, because they realize that they could phrase it in a maybe a more charitable way, or in a way where they realize it's a little less offensive, but get more specifically to what they're looking for. So that's one of my go-tos. Another is to acknowledge if I am struggling with the person, to let them know, and not just kind of respond out of that. So like you'll be tempted to fire back at them. Maybe it's like a fact, or maybe it's like an experience that you have that like comes to your mind whenever you're thinking about the racial divide of our nation, and it just comes out of this kind of nasty place of your heart. And so instead of like actually going to that thing, just describing what's happening in my heart really helps, because it's an act of humility and confession, really, where the Holy Spirit will help me. And there's even a self-awareness that then happens in my heart where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm getting more angry. This is not going to help the conversation. So those are some of the things that I've done.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I had a counseling class. A lot of things that you would do sort of in counseling can really be helpful too, which again is like, okay, now people are going to notice if I'm talking to them. You didn't do that. But took a counseling class with Ed Welch one time, and he was just commenting, and he just said, when in doubt, edit yourself. Like, because there's a lot of things coming, somewhere deep in your heart, processing in a very weak way through your brain. Your brain isn't really bringing any discernment. You just want to say it. And so everything wants to come out. And you see that sometimes where you see people going back and forth. You see it on social media. Okay, wow, there's just a lot being said here. And nobody's taking time to realize, is this really helpful? And so a lot of times what I'm trying to do is, okay, what's going to be helpful here for this moment in the conversation? I want to steward the moment, not, I don't care ultimately where we end up. To me, that's a big part of it. I just realize I don't care. I don't need to get you someplace, and I don't think I need to have you take me someplace. I want to have a successful conversation, because I can walk away from a successful conversation and change over time. That sense that I've got to tell you this because either you've got to really get me or I've got to change you is what drives us toward arrogance, I think. And so to me, a lot of it is just, okay, we don't need to do that. What we need to do is get to the other end of this and realize we experience the grace of God.
That's good.
And with unbelievers, that can be hard because the other person may not be tracking that. And so you recognize, what can I do so that their experience of me is something of the grace of God? So that's a big part of it for me. Just edit yourself. Remember what you're there for. You're not there to debate. You're there, and you're not necessarily there to have this person change you.
Right.
You're there so that at the end of the conversation, there's an awareness that God's grace was at work in their conversation.
That's good. Yeah, and what you're hitting on there is the people don't need the glory of me. Is what you just preached just a few minutes ago, of just because that's what it ultimately is. When we're getting offended, when we are saying, "Oh, I just need to say this," why? It's because I need this person to view me a certain way. I need this person to know that they're wrong and that my thoughts are more important, and that my feelings, that my emotions around this matter. And we can get fired up, and it's just that glory of me. And it's like, okay, what does it look like for me to humble myself and make sure the glory of God is the thing that is of utmost importance in this conversation? And I think one thing to note is oftentimes we can treat every conversation around race, justice, ethnic harmony, those kinds of things with people that we disagree with, as if we have to say everything in this conversation. And one, that it doesn't make sense for a number of reasons, because we're supposed to be building on the foundation of the friendship that we ought to already have, and building on the unity and reconciliation that we've achieved, that Christ has achieved for us. And from that, it's going to be a long journey of walking together in love. Like, I shouldn't want to just get it all out in the first conversation and never have to deal with it again. It's like, no, this is like unity is difficult. Like, unity is a long journey in which we are walking together in love, gritting our teeth together, bearing with one another. Is not like we're frolicking through a forest, holding hands and shouting, everything is perfect. We have to get into difficult conversations. We have to have these things.
It's a weird image.
You don't regularly frolic through the woods with people you disagree with?
The Lego movie or something. Everything is awesome. I don't know what's going on in your head.
There's a lot of things going on in my head. But it's that, it's like, no, this is difficult, but I'm here for this because, that's the whole idea of unity and diversity. We're hoping to grow with each other in love, and not win an argument.
That's really good. The idea of like valuing someone different than you through that is huge, because it's so often when we get into these conversations, if I'm honest, my whole goal is to try to influence this person to what I think, or pacify some sense of guilt that I'm feeling in my heart. And if those are the motivations for the conversation, we're not going to be able to speak in a way that prizes the other person above ourselves. And so I do think, that heart work, I think what we're getting at is before we enter these conversations, like even before we choose the words to speak, there's a cultivation of humility spiritually that takes place. And it's worth asking, the last time that you had a conversation with somebody that, what was your prep work like that for that? Did you just kind of drop in, without even thinking about it? 'Cause I often find
Or
it's
study up to get your points right.
yeah.
When they say this, I'm going to have this ready. And
Yeah, there'll be times where somebody's brought something up, and I won't enter into the conversation because I'm not at that place at that moment. Like or you can ask permission of someone. Like,
Yeah.
is it an okay time for us to talk about this?
Yeah.
I
That's
think
good.
be helpful.
Yeah, that's respectful. One other
that's,
thing, just
oh.
kind of going, is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I feel like we're in the same place these days on political conversations. They're so polarized. Some of the same things apply. I come into the conversation and I've got my, I got my sources and I got my this and I got this and my job is to defend where I'm coming from, and it elevates the potential toxicity of those conversations and the volatility of them. Whereas I think the goal of believers, we should be able to enter into conversations and out of conversations in a spirit of fellowship, because our identity isn't in those things. Our identity's together in Christ. Doesn't mean we agree, doesn't mean that we don't have significant differences. But I think that some of the same principles of humility apply for all of us in political conversations as well, because they're charged, and we're coming with different ideas about what's important. And that's one of the hard things about race conversations is everybody comes with different ideas about what's important. And so it's not just an esoteric argument. It's this is vital. Yeah. And because it's vital, I need to hold to it. And it would be wrong for anyone to say, well, that's not actually as vital as this is. So we have to retain the idea that I think something's essential without it becoming something that I need to impose upon you as well, or have imposed upon me. So
Yeah, and that gets into the question of what are the actual goals of having conversations.
Yeah.
Because it can't be to win an argument.
Yeah.
It can't ultimately be to just make the person parrot back to me everything I've said and be convinced of all my thoughts and opinions and all my experiences. I don't think that's what unity truly looks like, is just converting people so we're all this one monolithic entity of thought. So what do you guys hope for in conversations when you enter them? Or do you have goals? I guess would be another way to phrase that.
It sometimes depends on the relationship.
Yeah.
Like there's certain, there's just one couple in particular that Missy and I have had over, a lot of times. We've had many conversations. So the goals of that conversation on that particular day are just much grander, I think, in terms of wanting to really experience a oneness together in that moment of walking alongside one another, understanding each other better. And really, honestly, in those relationships, it's sort of like everything's on the table. You can talk about anything. With others, if it's the first conversation, it can just literally be we spoke about it, and we walked away with expressing affection, and that can be the basics of the goal of that. And so I think just the bridge that you have, the strength of that relational bridge you have with somebody, sometimes changes, how ambitious your goals are for that conversation.
Yeah. I think one thing for me in that is, the whole idea of counting others more significant than yourselves. One way to do that is oftentimes in conversations, I will have the goal of I want to at least have a full grasp of one or two ideas that this person has that I can articulate to them in a way in which they're saying, you get it. Because it's like I want to get down to the root of why this person feels this way. Like if someone has a very strong position on policing, or a strong position on other, especially like those one-off topics, and you see them getting either you see their emotions engaging. It's like, okay, I see their emotions. I want to know what is at the root of that. Like, do they have some type of life experience that's making them extra passionate about this facet of the conversation, or what that is? I want to understand them better and be able to articulate what they're feeling back to them.
That's really good.
Yeah. I'd love. I mean, I think you going into it with these things, like you said, you want to go and you get to know a person better. You want to build a sense of connection. But to me, I feel like the two things that would really be sweet to me would be for us to be able to be in conversation and drop in and out of sensitive things without having to stop and so I can ask, so what do you this just happened, what do you think about that? Or here's and have enough of a foundation together that we sort of know each other, we sort of know, so that not only can we have conversations that don't have to always be intense, but also that there are people I can go to. I say, listen, this just happened. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And you're really helping me. Or these are questions I have from that. Can you help me? And it not feel like, okay, we're just treading unpleasant turf. But we're just, I don't know. Or something happens and it's confusing and we're expressing, care and sympathy because we know each other well enough to know that might have hit you in a certain way. And, to me, that's just fellowship. It's just getting wisdom from one another. And I think there's value in getting wisdom from people who are not like you. I would say that about men and women. I think there's value in understanding somebody, for me, for understanding a woman's perspective, not to own it and, but I need to know how that affects you. So there's a lot of those kind of things, and I think race can be a hard one because we have done so little talking about it that we don't know how to get there. But to me, the goal is the nature of a relationship where you and I can have conversations about deep things without feeling like we have to be protective to do that.
Yeah. Good. I want to wrap up in about 6 or 7 minutes here. So I got 2 more I want to hit. So Andy, during your teaching, you hit heavy on the critique of the secular model of racial humility, the kind of shut up and listen from a minority to majority perspective. Mm-hmm. I just want to get into that just a little bit because I never want to just throw out a critique and not offer any type of alternative. Yeah. So rather than meeting with a shut up and listen perspective, because there is there is some value in coming in expecting to listen and learn. Sure. Obviously not shut up and listen. Like, I don't want to hear anything you have to say. But what would be a biblical humility in regards to the context of those conversations? Like, what would you?
Well, first of all, realizing that they come from somewhere. Yeah. They're not just some philosophical idea from the abstract. There comes from human experience, And one of the things I think that's interesting is a lot of times, a lot of where you see that, again, this is sort of the reinforcing majority is once a majority person gets woke, now they know everything, and now they can run the conversations, and now I'm going to lead, and thank you very much, appreciate your insight, but I got it now. Because, I think that's double down kind of frustration. Okay, now you actually sort of have the conversations, but you took it away from me again. And so I think recognizing that there's so many ways, particularly if we aren't thinking biblically, there can be an arrogance in being, feeling like, oh yeah, I'm woke, I got it, and where humility should drive us to is the more I experience something from someone else, the more I experience something from someone else who's from another country, from another culture, the more I should say, okay, there's a depth there that I'm only being introduced to the depth. It's like standing on the shore of the Pacific Ocean and saying, I can see the other side, right? No, get out there a little ways and see how far you go and realize, I don't know where I'm going. And I get lost out here. So I think there's a sense as believers, we should be marked by this idea that the amount we don't know is huge. And why don't we let other people do the work to help us understand? That should posture us to listen. I want to hear. I want to hear because this is a life learning journey for me. It's not a get the point thing. And I think sometimes, the way it bounces back into a white population that wants to know about it is we only want to know a certain amount.
Yes, exactly.
Enough to figure it out,
Right.
and now we're good.
And move on.
And move on, yeah. Yeah, so I think it's part of it is recognizing, no, as believers, if we really love each other, love other people, we got to go deeper than that. We got to be affected.
That's good. Yeah, and that requires humility.
Yeah.
In order to do that, it requires
Yeah.
okay.
It won't happen without humility.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's if you're approaching the conversation out of a sense of guilt,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and wanting to pacify your own conscience.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point.
That is not going to produce
Right.
Yeah.
what we're talking about, and
No.
I think there's a lot out there in the world about white guilt,
Mhm.
and some of it's not great, but there's something true about that, where there's a phenomena of sin in a lot of people's hearts, where we can approach the conversation not with the goal of prizing the other person's perspectives, looking for the best in what they're saying, making sure they feel loved, but rather actually approaching it so that we can put this to the side and not have to feel shame
Yeah.
over the topic. So I think that's just a vital thing, especially for myself, that I've had to deal with.
Yeah.
Teaching in Philly for a number of years, where I was, one of the only white people there, and embedded in a culture where we were talking about these things a lot. I often found my heart rising to defend myself in ways that really was not humility. That's not to say that you can't, say I don't think that's true of myself or whatnot, or stand for truth and things like that. But it's important for us to know that with the sinfulness of our hearts and the deceptiveness of our pride, that we're going to drift towards sort of a self-atonement in these conversations and want to absolve ourselves and make that the whole goal of talking.
That's good. So,
One more thing.
go for it.
This is,
Just taking over. I like it.
this is maybe too out there. But when you are critiquing a philosophy or idea set, right? Or you're looking at it, there are two important things to keep in mind. One is it comes from somewhere, and another is it has implications. And I think you take something like some of the ideas we're talking about, and I think people are rightly assessing kind of what I did today. There's implications for that. There's no way out of that. There's no way to humility, because at what point will I ever have a right to speak? It'll always be just listening. So there's no way to get to conversation that way. So that's an implication of this kind of racial humility idea. We have to understand that. But it also comes from somewhere, which means somebody has wrestled through to get something that makes sense to them, because they've had real experiences. It doesn't come from a test tube of ideas.
Right.
It comes from people trying to wrestle with things. And so I think if we recognize that we critique because they have implications, we've got to make sure those implications don't lead us down the wrong road. But they also come from places that we got to make sure we understand where they come from, or we don't really understand them. So.
Yeah, because, as a black person involved in these conversations, typically the response has been for me to shut up.
Yeah.
I haven't had a place to speak.
Yeah.
I haven't had the right to defend myself. I've had to justify and convince people of the realities of things that I'm experiencing. And so, but the response then ought not to be, okay, I've shut up for so long, now it's time for you to shut up.
Yeah.
The response, the Christian humble response, needs to be, okay, there is no way you are going to offend me more than I've offended God. There's no way I can offend you more than you've offended God. We are at an even playing field here, and let's discuss this, and let's listen to one another, and let's grow together in this. Lastly, just what one thing you guys do just in regular life to just cultivate humility, like a book that's just like that's helped you in that way, a practice that you guys have. And I just dropped that on you without telling you guys to think of one, so I'll give you a second.
Yeah, well, there's obviously the book by C.J. Mahaney that's awesome I think it's called Humility, but it's fantastic. If you haven't read it, read it. It's short and really good. But I think one thing that's always been helpful for me is remembering the promises associated with humility. And that's like, blessed are the poor in spirit, right? Happy are the poor in spirit. There's the kingdom of heaven, and you just have the ideas of God opposing the proud, giving grace to the humble, and the broken and contrite spirit being the fragrant offering to God. So just being able to frame humility not as a self-flagellation that's horrible, and I just have to like kind of beat myself up all the time, but rather thinking of it as beauty and as something that's producing a certain and abounding joy in my soul is something that's helped be sort of worldview shaping for me. So that I'm not just looking at conversations and just beating myself up over them, but really just saying, oh, this is one of the most glorious ways to live.
Yeah.
Is to be humble. I'm going to be more satisfied, content, and more of a pleasant person to be around. A better marriage, a better father. All these things are going to abound in blessing and happiness if I seek humility and being poor in spirit.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, I just sort of, I fell into this, but the last 10 years, my devotions, I always end by praying through a prayer in the Valley Vision, just, book of Puritan prayers. And I get through the whole book, I'll just start back again and just work through it. And I've probably been through it 8 times. And I think I'm going to do it the rest of my life. Yeah. Because I don't know of anything else besides just the Word, and the Word covers a lot of things, where you don't have this sense of the greatness of God and our needs that constantly, then those guys got it on that point. They got it. They got the you are God and I'm not. Right. Yeah. And so it doesn't mean I walk out of that quiet time like full of humility. But there, it's like that coach who's saying, no, you don't got it yet. No, you don't got it yet. We're not going to settle for where you're at. Right. And so, again, it's just a practice. But for me, it's just a relentless beat down of my pride. That sometimes hopefully results in change over time. Sometimes results in change that day when I realize, oh, this came up, and I have nobody to blame for myself because I just read it. When you're reading about humility in that form every day, there's never a point you can say, oh, I don't know where I was thinking. So that's just what I do, because I feel like my goal of when I'm not humble is because God's too small and I'm too big. And so I'm trying to constantly reverse that.
That's good. So for me, obviously, I'm going to throw in Gentle and Lowly, that book by Dane Ortland. Just seeing Christ's heart for sinners, seeing how Christ responds in love towards us, helps cultivate a type of humility. And then also just kind of a desperation and relentless pursuit to have a robust prayer life. Someone who is communing with God through prayer regularly, that is just an active killing of pride. Speaking to God, expressing your dependence on Him, confessing your sins to Him, helps cultivate humility. So I think we're a little over the time, so I'm gonna wrap it up here. I'm going to finish by reading some from 1 Peter 5. And don't forget the resource page on our website is live now. What is it? You go to member resources and you click down at the bottom. It should be titled Ethnic Harmony. We've got books, articles, podcasts. All of these live streams will be there. And that'll be a list that is updated as we continue to grow, because we never arrive at this and we got it and we're good. There's new books coming out this year that I think will make it on that list. The church is just really, because so many voices are speaking into this, the church has to be vigilant in bringing biblical perspectives, humble, Godward focused thoughts to this topic. And so we want to get those into the hands of you guys. So 1 Peter 5 says this: "Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you." Amen.